So I'm going to at least begin this with a two-part phase. So I definitely want to go over drawing in Rhino, especially for some that may have never drawn anything in Rhino. But I also want to start to get into Photoshop as well. So a lot to address, at least in this first part. So we're going to go a little quick. So at least in our case, I'm going to make a new model. And at least the first thing I want to demonstrate is that I can trace these lines and put them into Photoshop really effectively. Right, so for some of you guys who already know my workflow, I like to go from Rhino to Illustrator to Photoshop, right? The reason being is, well, I do all of my drawing in Rhino, and I'd really recommend this to get in the habit of this, right? To either draw in AutoCAD or Rhino most frequently. Change line weights, and that's it in Illustrator, right? So maybe colors, line weights, and then of course manipulation of those things and fine tuning in Photoshop. So at least an explanation of that workflow. So the first thing that I'll do here is establish my picture and to scale, right? So of course the picture that we have is at least a demonstration of our piece, right? So let's take that to JPEG somewhere. Where'd it go? I just had it. Let's just get it from here. Perfect. So I basically just need to decide 2 points, and this is where I would take it to scale, right? Especially if I was doing this for a studio project and I do need it to be to some sort of scale, I would need to know at least one dimension on here. Maybe there's a graphic scale. Doesn't really look like it. However, it does seem like there is a dimension that we could go off of. For the sake of argument and the speed of tutorial, I'll just say that this is 10 feet. Or do you guys know? Did Gonzalez say? We'll assume then. So I'm going to go with 12 feet. I'm going to draw a line from that base, and I'm going to type in 12 feet, enter, and it's going to give me a 12-foot line. As you can see, my image is fairly small, right? So obviously I need to make my image a little bit bigger, but I want to tell it how big to be. So I'm going to click on the image, I'm going to type in scale, enter. It's going to ask me for my base point, which happens to be this line and the end of that line. And it's going to ask me, okay, well, what are you trying to make equal 12 feet? And in our case, it's that second line. So first things first, I'm basically just scaling my drawing so that it's at least somewhat anatomically correct. Right. There's our line, and look at that. I accidentally scaled it to the wrong line. Let's do it again. Scale, base point. We'll take that second point, which happens to be our midpoint, I guess in this case. I guess I accidentally got the midpoint. There it is. Nice. So now anything that I measure, it will at least be somewhat accurate, right? I could use DIM, right? And I can go from here to there and actually get a reading. So 1,855 millimeters, right? If I wanted to, of course, change the units, I could type in units and switch that out of millimeters, right, to feet. Yes. Of course, it's actually going to scale my entire drawing. Now it's actually 1,855 feet, which isn't good, so I'm going to disregard the units and put that back. Does that make sense, guys? Right, so it's not actually going to change the number of units, it's just going to change the units itself. So that it's definitely something to be aware of. So I'm going to put it back in millimeters, and it's usually millimeters by default as well. Anyway, not a bad spot to be. I can lock this, so I can type in lock, enter, and I can get to tracing. One thing, you know, I always like to enforce or at least recommend is being absolutely organized, right? So the first thing I want to do in my layers is maybe type in walls and other things that I'm going to use. So roof. Do I got any stairs in there? It doesn't look like I have any stairs. I could say fascia boards. Right, I could get really specific about everything that I'm going to trace. Windows. So just double clicking and renaming some things. I could even get my shade and shadow in there, right? So what have you. You know, I'm not going to trace the entire thing, but one of the commands I really like is polygon or polyline tool. So in my case, let's say I get the walls first, so I'm going to activate my walls layer. I'm going to type in polyline and really just get get to tracing, right? Now I want to be as accurate as possible, so I can hold shift to make something actually perfectly straight, right? And in my case, I'm just on my walls layer, so I'm just going to get, you know, something close to my walls and fake it till I make it, classically, right? Don't want to accidentally get some of that shadow. Again, I'm just sort of tracing the walls. In fact, a little bit of inaccuracy is what makes something look quite perfect. I usually have a story about Toy Story 1 and Toy Story 4. And Toy Story 1 is pretty laughable if you look at the graphics. And it's because they're too perfect, right? But of course, Toy Story 4 has the weathering, it has the bumps, it has all the imperfections that of course make it look more like reality. So one thing I would say is while you're tracing, I wouldn't worry so much unless it's a construction drawing, right? Now if it's for studio and you know it's my own design, of course I can be specific. I can say 16 feet. I don't need to do something ridiculous. But especially in this kind of case where I've already drawn it in some way and I'm just trying to make it digital. There are other tools such as Vectorize, but it won't work on something like this, right? And in this case, we're actually just trying to make a little what's coloring book, right? So every time you get a coloring book, it's kind of just the lines and then we fill it in. We don't necessarily have to use those lines, right? So for instance, I'm basically tracing it so I can make it easier for myself in Photoshop. For instance, sometimes the magic wand won't go around this tree, or you know, there might be some elements where it's actually a little too open, and it's getting information that I don't necessarily want. So I'll explain what I mean by that essentially. But let's go ahead and trace one more thing for the sake of tutorial and get some more walls in there. So of course we have this stone wall. We get some of that. I can hold shift, definitely make sure it's straight. Could just get this entire wall, right? Doesn't look like the drawing's actually too straight. Could be the scan. No, I don't know. But it's also a good chance, and you guys may have known this, and you may be already bored with this building and know everything about it. But of course, in tracing any architecture, you're going to learn how and what it's doing, right? Which is also important. We're just going to get the rest of those walls. And fake it till I make it. But now if I unlock and I move that image, right, I should have something traced, right, to say the very least. At least this will be our trace for today. There's our 12-foot marker. We could keep it, I mean we could do a lot with it, but what's nice is I know what that distance is, so I could scale my drawing really at any point. So the first thing that I wanted to show you guys, but isn't absolutely necessary, right, is to of course put this in Illustrator first. So in my case, I'm going to take all of my lines, I'm going to file, export selected, and I can turn it actually into a few things that Illustrator will allow and take. So in my case, I'm going to go with either Adobe Illustrator or a DWG, or you know, honestly a DXF works, an SVG works, and another reason to use Rhino is because, well, it's pretty universal. It works for almost every program. Another great reason to use it. So in my case, I'm going to go with Adobe Illustrator. I'm just going to save it on my thumb drive real quick and call it Test Lines. Sweet. It's going to ask me for some options. In my case, I do want it to be to scale, so 25.4 milliliters does equal 1 inch. However, I could scale it here. As you guys know, this is true scale going on. So if I wanted it at 1/4 scale, I could say an inch equals 1/4 of an inch, right? Or sorry, 1 foot. So I would actually need to change this into the number of feet. Anybody know how many millimeters are in a foot? It would be this number times 12. If you could give me that number. 12,000 exactly? 25.4 times 12? That doesn't sound right. 304.8. And we'd want to make that equal 0.125. So that would be 1/8 of an inch or 1/4, right? So we can do some of that scaling already in the file, which is kind of nice. All right, so let's go ahead and open it. Should have opened Illustrator. This might take a second or two. However, I would say again, this isn't a necessary step. In fact, we could open up this Adobe Illustrator file directly from that Adobe Illustrator file that we made. We could open it up directly in Photoshop, but like I said, we're just trying to get a coloring book version so that we can make things a little easier for Photoshop. So in my case, I'm going to go ahead and open that file. I think I saved it on my thumb drive, test lines. Go ahead and open it. I have the wrong artboard, but it's at a decent scale to say the least, right? So of course I can go to File, Document Setup, and hopefully a lot of this is of course just review. Sorry if I'm going way too fast, but I do want to make sure that I get it on 11 by 17, or at least find the paper that matches 1/4 scale, right? So if that's a 24 by 36, let's make it a 24 by 36. In our case though, let's just go with 18 by 12. That's a pretty good sized piece of paper. See if it fits on there. Oh, I don't want to make a new artboard. Doesn't look like it's going to fit there completely, right? In fact, if I take it over, we can definitely assume that it does not fit. Maybe it was at 1/16 scale. I could also scale this as well. So if I go to Transform, Scale, if it's at 1/4 scale and I take it to 50%, it'll be 1/8 scale, correct? All right, do a little bit of math there. So at least it fits at 1/8 scale, so let's go with maybe 1/8 scale. Not a big deal. I would say, at least for this exercise, guys, we're going to want an 11 by 17, so let's go ahead and maybe do that. I have it as a 12 by 18, so let's make sure that it fits on 11 by 17. Sweet. Still fits 1/8 scale on 11 by 17, right? And that's really nice to do because I'd want to check that before I got into Photoshop anyway, right? So this is of course what I meant by the layers. I can go to layers, I can select all the walls by just clicking on this outside. I can double click on that red and immediately change the color. I would say, and I know I say it all the time, but we don't use perfect black in architecture, and the reason why is because it's too black when we print it. In fact, what I would say is go up a little bit. We want something that looks more like the graphite that you're putting on, right? We almost, in a sense, want to trick somebody a little bit that they can't tell if this is digital or analog, right? We don't want to make it just so blatantly obvious that it's digital, right, to say the least. Usually it's overbearing and it looks very robotic, and that's not the look that we're going for. Well, we want to look like a human made it, of course, with the right tools. So in my case, I'm going to use that off black, and like I said, it still looks like black, right? But it's going to print a lot better for us. But anyway, say we were done with this. I mean, say this had all the tracings. It had the roofs, it had the windows, it had, just everything about it. I could highlight it all. And what's really nice about the Adobe programs is I can drag it right in. So in my case, I'm going to create a new file, 11 by 17 at 300 resolution, and press OK. So have my 11 by 17, perfect. And, quite nicely, as long as I get my windows correct. You usually have, 2 screens going on. I can drag it right in, right, as a smart object. What's really nice is, well, I can change the line weight here, I can change the shade and shadow elements. I could do a lot, of course, in Illustrator to make sure it's a vector. You may not know this yet, the Illustrator is a vector program, whereas Photoshop is a rasterized program. So of course they do work very differently, and because Adobe actually didn't make them. But anyway, different story. We don't necessarily need our Illustrator file anymore, so we're just going to work in Photoshop for the rest. But like I said, just as a reminder, you could just move straight to Photoshop too, right? I could obviously just make it traced, I can make a PDF, and again, I'm just using it as a template. I don't even have to have these lines, right? However, don't get me wrong, it is optional. If you spend the time tracing all those lines and finding the line weight, you might as well use them. Anyway. Let's continue.
Your layers do not transfer over once you do that, right?
Correct, right? It comes in as one smart object. which is why it's important to make those changes first in Illustrator before I drag it in. Absolutely great question. But let's talk some Photoshop. Like I said, our rotation's mostly governed by Photoshop, and don't get me wrong, I think we're all kind of teaching the same thing, but at least you're knowing the way that I do it, right? Versus someone else, right? Because we all do have kind of different tips and tricks to show, right? But like I said, I want to use this as a coloring book, so I can, right? I also wanted to go over that, well, we could do this with our own line drawing as well, just in case you didn't know. So now that we got step one, the digital tracing, let's see what the other option is if I analogically trace that drawing as well. And I scan it and I bring it in, right? So let's go ahead and open that rotation. And let's say that was my scan. Dang, Alex Gonzalez, that's a great tracing, right? However, you can do that too. One thing I would say is let's try not to use this exact file, right? One thing I would say is either trace it digitally or trace it analog, right? That's at least step one. For the sake of tutorial though, I don't have it traced, right? So I do apologize. But for the sake of showing some of the things that we can do, I definitely do want to show it. So first things first is we have this yellowish background, right? Maybe not exactly what I want unless I was going for maybe sort of that vintage architectural look. And I very well could be, but at least for the sake of tutorial, let's remove some of that stuff. So first thing I need to do is actually unlock it. And there's a couple things I could do. So I could use a magic wand tool, right? And I could see sort of what gets erased. I could press delete. But as you can see, it kind of missed some things, right? It kind of gets in there a little bit. It didn't get rid of all the yellow, right? However, the best way to get rid of all the yellow is to right click on the layer, go to blending options. Under the first blending options and general blending, select multiply, right? And then go ahead and mess with the white counter, right? So in our case, it's set to gray, which is fine. See what I did there? All the yellow is systematically removed through that blending option, right? So I'm just basically deciding where the white point is. And if I go ahead and press OK, look how much time I saved myself. Right? All of that is now transparent. I can draw behind it, I can make it something else, and whatnot. So maybe the first thing I want to do is actually bring my background back so that I can have a nice white background now. So I'm going to go ahead and make another layer. I'm going to call it white background. Oh, not blending options. I can double click on the layer, white background. Another thing to keep in mind is most programs work this way in their layer systems, that if it's at the top, it's basically assuming that that layer is technically on the top. So my white background, I may actually want it, of course, at the bottom of my picture, right? At the background most of the part. So I'll take that layer. Of course, it has nothing on it until I put something on it. So I could do a few things. I could brush it in, right? Which I honestly like to do because, like I said, I kind of want error, right? So I do things that that sort of look more analog, to say the least. So I'm going to make sure that I'm using white and make sure that I'm on the white background and of course brush that in, right? Of course I have it under my selection still, so I need to do Command D, deselect, and of course fill that in, right? Of course the more that I fill it in, the more white that it actually gets. Maybe barely noticeable on the projector, but can you guys see that? It almost looks like it's perfectly whitewashed for us now. But of course this is what we can do on our yellow trace paper, and a lot of this is of course what we have to do for our portfolio, right? We trace, I mean, we got all kinds of drawings, right? We got them on white paper, we got them on yellow paper, and we don't necessarily want to have all that checkerboard effect of yellow and clear on our portfolio. So a lot of what I'm doing right now is actually what you would do to every image before you put it in your portfolio. So almost two birds with one stone here. But like I said, we're trying to get that white background. We could do it with a brush, but we could also just fill it in for the sake of time, right? So a couple of these tools, and I actually forget where my fill bucket is. Too many tools. Of course I could right click and see what others are kind of in there. And you'll notice that each of these tools definitely have a lot involved, right? So there's my paint bucket tool. Of course it's in my gradient tool. So things move around. But clearly I can just click on that background and make it all white. And even if I just wanted to double check and make sure what was going on, right, I could definitely see the difference, right? But first things first, I got rid of that yellow paper, right? Now, for the sake of drawing, what I like to do is kind of Bob Ross style. Has anybody seen Bob Ross? Right? He never starts with the trees at the front. Of course, he starts with the background, right? He starts with the sky, and he works his way up towards the foreground. That way it actually hides, and he's systematically hiding what he wants to do to complete the composition. Usually in his case, a wonderful landscape. However, in most elevations, what do we have in the background, guys? A beautiful landscape of some sort, or some sort of context, right? Trees, sky, birds, all kinds of elements that we want to introduce. So at least in my elevation, I don't specifically have a site for this. In fact, I would love for this exercise that you invent where this place is, right? Since, you know, we can have some fun with it. Don't put it on the moon or anything, it's kind of ridiculous, but at least be somewhat, you know, practical. Can't tell you how many times during the 2020 Zoom thing, so many people put it on the moon or Mars, and I was like, okay, first of all, we can't verify, I can't go there and like see what that actually looks like. But anyway, I do think it's fun. Anyway, let's talk about the sky first. So in my case, I could draw the sky, I could do it in marker, and I could scan it in. I could do it that way. Or I could do it completely digitally. In fact, what I would suggest, if you do it analog, it looks really nice to have this hybridized drawing, right? To have both analog and digital simultaneously. It both looks unfinished, yet has care, it has human qualities about it, yet looks perfect, looks thought out, like digital quality usually gives us. So in my case, like I said, sky first. Let's go ahead and make a sky layer. We'll call it sky. Of course, I'll put it between my lines and my background. So I'm going to rename this analog lines. I'm going to spell it wrong so I know. Sorry, very dyslexic. Not entirely important for the sake. Anyway, let's get that sky, but let's talk about the sky a little bit, right? So I'm going to go to Google Images. It's probably the only time I like to use Google. The image generation is pretty good. Otherwise, I do use DuckDuckGo. If you are tired of ads in all of your videos, if you're not using Brave browser already, get on it, right? Because it helps significantly. If I could get paid for every time I said that, that'd be great, but I'm of course not. However, I should work on that. Anyway, Google Images, let's go ahead and look up sky texture. The important word here is actually texture because, well, if I just type in sky, I'm gonna get a lot of different things, but I do want something of a swatch that is quite specific. So in an elevation, am I showing perspective? No, not usually. So I wouldn't choose something like this, right? Because that's already at some sort of forced perspective, right? You can almost imagine the kind of lines going on. However, we do want that effect where we see sort of big clouds towards us, smaller clouds towards the back. However, we don't want those super wide angle views of 360 degree views, right? Because it often looks, our elevation actually look a little bit more fake. However, let's see what we can do with it, because you know it's definitely not bad. I mean, we can always manipulate it, but something like this looks already more elevation, right? It looks a little bit more flat. However, I don't really get the same sense of scale there. There's a good sense of scale there, right? Kind of a, not necessarily a perspective, but at least the clouds are like that. However, just because we can, let's add some color in there. I kind of actually appreciate that one because there's this nice orange glow at the bottom. I can imagine ours sort of covering up some of that. And there's a nice glow in there. It's very Bob Ross to me. I do want to click on it and make sure that it's something I can actually obtain. So I can right click, open image, a new tab, and we can see what that image is. Looks pretty good. In fact, if you have some computers, usually you can notice that it's a JPEG, right? And drag it right in. So that's usually pretty nice. However, it is pretty small, but honestly, it'll work for our situation. Let's go ahead and make sure just how small it is though. I wouldn't recommend always dragging and dropping. I always recommend sort of saving the image, putting it somewhere nice, calling it sky. I might be able to use it later, right? I might actually need it later because I'm making 4 elevations, right? So do keep that in mind. I'm gonna go ahead and put on my card, just kind of keep everything in the same spot, and we'll save that sky. Now the way that we would place an image is of course File and Place Embedded. And the reason I say embedded is because, well, I don't want to open this file and suddenly nothing's there, right? So of course, place embedded solves that solution. So we'll go ahead and embed it, sky. Look at that, it actually happened to be a lot bigger. So again, a good reason not to always drag and drop, right? However, it's in the wrong spot, so let's go ahead and put in the sky. I guess we don't need this sky layer anymore. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. And let's go ahead and manipulate the sky a little bit, right? So the first thing that we can do is Control T or Command T if you have a Mac, right? And that stands for transform. Now, if I hold shift, it's going to stay proportional. However, it's not super important for the sky image to be proportional. So I can kind of stretch it a little bit. However, keep in mind, I don't want to overdo it, right? I don't want to make it look fake. But I do want to get the extent of the entire screen. Maybe I don't want so much of that orange. However, keep in mind, it is kind of this forced perspective going on that starts to get smaller at the horizon. It looks, what I'm trying to say is we're going for reality, right? But we're not being super photorealistic, right? Just like we would do in freehand, we're going for a representation of something. However, I would say, usually if it looks too real, we get that Toy Story 1 effect. So be careful. We want that kind of fuzzy air and sort of relating to something, right? At the end of the day, we want the architecture to stick out the most, and the material and the communication of those things. So be aware that you can't say everything at 100%, right? There is a hierarchy. So we got our sky. However, I would say it's pretty loud right now. I can't even hear the architecture. So I'm going to tone it down with my opacity just a little bit. I also know that's going to print really well too. Usually it looks much better on the digital screen than it does when it prints. So I've known that for a little while, so you may notice like, why is Professor making everything really, really light? Well, it's because I know that when I print it, it's gonna get 50% darker than what it looks like on the screen. So again, some things to write down for sure. Very often I usually put things at about 42%. Has anybody ever seen, what is it, the guide, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Has anybody seen that movie? Where it says the answer of all things is actually just number 42. So I always use the number 42 when, of course, possible. Anyway, maybe a bad joke. Kind of shows how dated I am. I think that movie came out in 1992, so some of you guys weren't born yet, so I do get that. Anyway, we got our sky. Maybe our next thing that we want to get is our ground. So right now we kind of have this orange element in the ground. We may want to remove our sky for some reason. However, you know, one of the things that we'll want to reflect on our windows is, of course, that sky, right? So that's going to be really nice to see, and it's going to look, you know, pretty realistic, especially with this nice black shadow that we got going on. Well, it's not exactly black, but pretty darn close. Look at that. You can like see the texture in the paper. That's what makes a good drawing, though, right? Because subconsciously, when those are printed out, you don't really see it, but you know, your brain knows that this was analog, right, at some point. But that's what I meant by the trick. We kind of want to trick them a little bit, right? So even the first thing that we can do with the sky is we can add some blur, because that blur means that it's being pushed far into the distance. So I'm going to take that sky, I'm going to go to filter, and we can add a blur. I particularly like Gaussian blur because that has a lot to do with the atmosphere. So I'm going to go with Gaussian, and you can see if I do too much, it kind of gets super fuzzy, right? It's almost like can't even tell or make out what it is. So very often I use something around like 50 pixels. It really depends on the size of the drawing. Like I said, it is a raster program, so I don't necessarily want huge amount of detail, but again, just that slight fuzziness in the back, right? So not too bad. Awesome. And I can even sort of check that out. So let's go ahead and get the ground, or maybe remove it from our piece right here. So a couple of things I could do to do that. I particularly like my lasso tool. However, the lasso tool is kind of just like almost like a freehand thing. Now in architecture, when we select something, usually we're selecting very straight shapes, right? So I particularly like the polygonal lasso tool. Sorry, say that 5 times fast. I can do Command + to zoom in, and just for reminder, I can hold spacebar and pan, right? So very helpful. But in my case, I might have to actually trace some of this because there's honestly a lot of stone here. I can't use the magic wand. And anybody who's used the magic wand definitely knows that. So in my case, I need to basically just trace what I want the sky to be. So in my case, I'm just going to trace the architecture so I can remove the sky from it. Not this guy, but the sky, right? Sorry, my mumbling gets involved. But in my case, you know, it's going pretty slow with that sky on it. So two things I could do if I notice my computer's going really slow. I can turn things off, and typically things will go faster, right? So if I do lasso tool now, let's see what happens. And it's still pretty slow. It might be because I have a ton of things running, so bear with me for a second. Let's close some things. And in fact, you know, let's get rid of everything except Photoshop and Brave browser. Yeah, Rhino's definitely the one slowing it down. Oh my gosh. Don't really need to save this, I guess. So let's go ahead and delete it. See if that helps anything. Well, that's going a little bit faster. And of course, if I wasn't screen recording, it would of course go faster too. But for the sake of tutorial, let's try that again. So I'm going to hit L for lasso. And much better. All right, definitely going a lot faster. But again, I'm just tracing the architecture. That way I can get rid of some of the things. I'm going to just kind of fake it till I make it today, right? And for, you know, honestly, the sake of tutorial, right? I could zoom out a little bit, get that bottom line. But again, I'm just tracing the architecture so I can basically remove the sky from it. What's kind of nice is once I do these things, I can save them as layers, and I don't necessarily have to ever trace it again, right? Because once I've made this trace, and I'll of course show you what I mean. We're basically going to save this trace that we did. You'll notice that I'm also clicking on the inside of my line because I do want that line to eventually cover anything that I don't accidentally erase. So I don't want to go outside the line. I don't want to go too inside the line. I want to almost get right in the middle of it, right? We'll leave the flag out for now. Maybe it gets colorized. Oh, I may accidentally mess up like that. If you ever do that, just click on that same spot again and nobody will ever know. Right? Same thing with there. Oh crap, I did it again. Right? Just go back to your same point and retrace. And the reason it's doing that is because I'm letting go of spacebar before I've clicked. Just in case you want to know what I'm doing wrong. I think it's helpful because, trust me, nobody does it perfect the first time. I can hold shift again to make sure that it's straight or just trace the drawing. Of course, I don't have to do this step if I did it digitally. So there's kind of the bonus of doing it digitally too. I could just use the magic wand tool, boom, I've got my trace. So again, one of the benefits of doing all that tracing in digital is I don't have to do that tracing now in Photoshop. So what you're seeing right now is actually, well, the analog version. If I chose to scan an analog image in, of course, I would have to trace it. Zoom out a little bit, and it looks like we're almost done. In fact, we'll know we're done when that little lasso tool turns into a 0, or if I double click, it's going to complete it for me. So say I actually wanted some of the sky in this portion, right? Maybe that's actually seen right through. I can hold shift, and I can use even another selection tool. If I hold shift and click, I can basically add to that selection or subtract from that selection. So in my case, I want to subtract because I actually got all of the building. So if I hold Alt or Option key, I can subtract from that selection, right? I could do the same thing with my magic wand tool. Again, I want to subtract from my selection, so I'm going to hold that one. Didn't quite get it because I'm accidentally on the sky. So I need to actually go to my layers. There we go. Right. But now it's actually a part of my selection. So when I go to sky and I hit erase or the letter E, I can actually get rid of some of that that's in the sky. Now, I have the wrong layer, so I'm accidentally erasing the wrong layer. Thank goodness for Command Z, right? So I'll actually go to my sky layer. Of course, use a much bigger eraser. Oop. And it's asking me to basically rasterize this so that I can erase it. Right? Of course, now I can't see my white background in there. Actually, why is that? Oh, because I don't have my white background on. There we go. But already looking pretty nice, right? Especially since this is all analog and we have this background. So those pieces that I subtracted, I'm able to see through now. Right? Already looking pretty good, right? Maybe the next thing I want to do is actually the windows, or even some of the background information I could probably get in there. Let's see, we have about 10 minutes left, so yeah, let's get those windows in there because those are beautiful. Well, let's go over a different way of obtaining those. So it looks like I can use the magic wand tool. Those definitely look like closed boxes. So maybe my next layer, I'm going to go with windows, because if I know anything about windows, I know that they reflect the sky. I mean, what color is a window, guys? Nobody knows because they're transparent, right? But if you actually go outside right now, they look black, right? Because of that reflection index, right? However, if you really look at it, there's actually a reflection of, well, whatever's around it, right? So maybe I'm in a studio class and I want to show the reflection of across the street. Could I do that? Yeah, I could go to Google Street View, take a screenshot and put it on these windows. I could blur it out a little bit and somebody's gonna notice it, right? Somebody, especially the OCD architects that exist and are like myself, will definitely notice those nice fine details. But again, it's all about the hierarchy. So, like I said, let's go ahead and make the windows. We'll make them dark and of course reflect the sky. I might need the sky image again, but that's okay. I have it somewhere, right? So let's get the windows first. I'm going to go ahead and use my magic wand tool, and of course I can set a tolerance to it as well. Uh-oh, looks like it might be open a little bit, and look what happens when it's open a little bit, right? So I'm going to make sure I'm on my analog lines layer, and since it's open right there, watch what happens. Ah, man, it got everything. It didn't get the window like I just needed. What's another way I could just get the window? Selection tool, right? It is already rectangular, so I could just trace it again and make sure that I get all my windows. I can hold shift and I can add to that selection, and of course I'm getting the shadow in there too, right? Because I want it to kind of be underneath that little bit of shadow. Let's try the magic wand tool again. That one looks pretty close. Dang it Gonzalez, right? However, maybe we can set our tolerance different. So I'm going to change it to 15. That means it's going to take less pixels, right? It's going to be more specific. So if I hold shift, add to my selection, hey, not bad. However, it didn't get quite everything. What's cool is I can just keep clicking and it's going to get a lot closer, right? But look at it, it's a bit fuzzy. So keep in mind, maybe I'm going for that effect. Maybe I do it a couple of different ways. However, it also doesn't get that shade and shadow portion either. So I'll do it a couple of different ways to kind of just show us what happens, right, to say the least. But in my case, I'm going to go with something that's a little quicker for me. So I'm just going to get all of these shapes. Right, I'm going to hold shift so I can add to my selection. Again, hold shift. I do have to release shift and hold it again though, right? So I undid shift, hold shift again. Does that make sense, guys? Similar to like any other program, right? I'll get some of those. I'll show you what happens if I get that medium. That way we have a couple of examples of, just how wrong this can all go, right? Beautiful faked shadow right there. I love it. It would totally encompass that window, but he was like, you know what? I want to show off the window. That's the power of analog, right? That is not so easily done in photo or digitally. Anyway, So we have our windows outline. Let's go ahead and kind of save them as like a base file. So I'm going to go to my windows, and I can color this anything. I could also just use it. So in my case, I want to start with a dark base, like I said, for that window. I'm going to start with a dark base, to say the least. So let's go ahead and get those. Oh, wrong color. Sometimes you basically get two colors to work with, right? What I like to do, and the reason I use the brush, guys, is because I make it my own, right? I like to kind of add a little bit in there. See that anomaly that I just added? I just whimsically do it. It's not about being perfect. Like I said, the versus Toy Story 1 versus Toy Story 4, you kind of want that little imperfection, to say the least, right? Because look, nobody's ever going to see it, right? But it's actually adding to the composition of the drawing. So let's get the rest of the windows, right? And I don't want it too funky, right? I mean, this one's definitely going to be darker because it's in the shade, right? You sort of add to that. And they don't necessarily all have to be the same either, right? Does that make sense though, guys? Right? And already you're like, digital? Analog? I don't really know. And that's, again, the effect that we want. So I'm going to deselect that just to kind of show you like, oh crap, I accidentally forgot my selection. Good thing I have it on a layer now though, right? Because now that Windows layer is completely separate. So what's nice is I can use my magic wand tool. I can click on the outside of it. It's going to find everything for me. It's going to already select it for me. And then I can simply right click and select the inverse, right? So in my case, I do want the sky. However, I deleted that part that was inside. You guys remember? So I need to maybe place it again. In this case, I don't really need to place it embedded because I'm going to erase it and turn it into a new layer, but maybe that's besides the point. That's looking good. It doesn't really matter if I line it up ever so perfectly. In my case, I want it kind of behind my windows so I know basically what to get rid of. Unfortunately, when I add something, it's going to get rid of that selection, so I do need to use Magic Wand again, right? It finds it for me. And basically, I want everything inside the window, so I do have to select the inverse and erase the rest of it, right? So I could definitely move this sky around, right? But I'll just keep it for what it is. It's not too bad. I get some of it in there. And let's go ahead and erase that. So it's going to say, oh, you got to rasterize it. That's okay, right? Oh, I accidentally got rid of the inside, right? Make sure that's the right layer. Great. Oh, it's getting the inside, right? So when in doubt, select inverse and make sure. Right? There we go. But now we should be able to see a little bit of sky in there. I don't see it though yet. So let's check. What's going on here? Ah, I know why. Because the windows are on top and they're not transparent yet. So I did have it right. Let's go ahead and erase all of it though. And let's go ahead and put that window and sky. I'll put the sky on top because, well, that's the reflection. And I can even say something like window reflection. That way, I don't get mixed up with two different skies. So I'm going to go with window reflection. Like I said, the more organized I am, guys, honestly, the better I can change something in Studio. My professor's going to come back, I hate this sky. Great, I've got a sky layer, I can just change it, right? I don't have to do all of this over again, right? Same thing with analog, right? But let's go ahead and turn things on and see how they look. Right, it's starting to get there. Almost kind of have this blue tint to it. So I'm going to take that window reflection, I'm going to take it down a notch. There we go, just a tad, right? Just enough to have this little hint of blue. Now it looks like it got a little fuzzy on that magic wand, right? Not great, it kind of looks funny, right? But not too bad, especially once we print this out. And I would say even this is actual scale. All right, this is more like an 11 by 17 at least. in real time. Right. So keep in mind, we do focus really hyper intensive, right, to say the least. However, keep in mind that eventually it'll be printed, and those minute things will either sort of subtly be noticed or maybe not. Right. However, I would say I have about 2 minutes left, so I'll go ahead and stop it here. But as you can imagine, on Friday we'll start from right here. We'll continue with the trees. We'll continue with maybe some stucco. We'll talk about obviously the other materials that would go on the face of this. But essentially the concept is about the same as these windows, but we'll go ahead and cover it on Friday. It's enough to digest, I think. What I would say to get started is either start tracing it analog and scanning it and getting it into Photoshop, or tracing it digitally and doing that process. Sound good, guys? I'll end it here.